Folks used to call him the Sun King, a guy who swore he was God's hand-picked man on earth, his very existence supposedly lighting up the world like a blazing torch. But in his final days, Louis XIV of France turned into something far scarier than any king ought to be. A grim, living proof that even the mightiest of us are just decaying flesh waiting for the end. What I'm about to share isn't just the tale of a king's death. It's the crumbling of an entire way of thinking, laid bare through the ghastly, stomach-churning details the court scribes fought hard to bury. This is the story of how Europe's grandest monarch spent his last weeks as a rotting husk that wouldn't quit, and how his people watched in dread as their so-called divine king showed he was just a frail, reeking, terrified mortal. For 72 years, Louis XIV gripped France with a velvet-gloved iron fist, ruling with unyielding authority wrapped in dazzling pomp. He turned a backwater medieval kingdom into Europe's top dog, built the jaw-dropping Versailles Palace, and convinced a whole continent he was chosen by God to reign supreme. By 1715, at 76 years old, he'd outlasted his son, his grandson, and pretty much everyone from his era, standing alone as the last relic of a fading age. But the France of 1715 wasn't the shining realm of Louis's younger days. Years of pricey wars had bled the treasury dry. Brutal winters brought starvation to the common folk, and the nobles, once eager to fawn over their king, were fed up with his constant demands for pomp and obedience. The once glorious Versailles court, the envy of all Europe, had turned into a hollow stage where tired aristocrats played out pointless rituals for a king who seemed more like a museum piece than a ruler. Yet Louis flat out ignored the shifting world around him, clinging to his rigid routine of ceremonies and audiences even as his body and kingdom buckled under debt and unrest. Each morning, he still went through his lever, that fancy ritual where he got dressed in front of a hand-picked crowd of nobles, like a performance that never stopped. Every evening, he held court, greeting petitioners and ambassadors as if his words still carried the same clout they once did. The kicker? While Louis kept acting like the almighty king, his real power had been slipping away for years. His ministers called most of the shots now. His generals ran the show on their own terms, and the nobles were starting to murmur amongst themselves about what had happened when the old man finally kicked the bucket. The Sun King's light was dimming, but he wouldn't admit the darkness was closing in. That summer of 1715, those closest to Louis started noticing small shifts in how he acted and looked, subtle but impossible to miss. The king, who'd always boasted about his strong build and commanding presence, seemed to be shrinking, like his grand royal robes were slowly swallowing him whole. His legendary appetite, famous across Europe, started to fade, and the lavish court feasts that once showed off the kingdom's wealth became awkward affairs where he barely touched his plate. Worse still, Louis's mind wasn't as sharp as it used to be. The man who once owned every room now seemed far off, distracted, often zoning out in key meetings or repeating himself in talks. The court doctors, used to handling minor aches or ceremonial gripes, found themselves facing something way uglier than anything they'd seen before. They muttered about bringing in experts from Paris, but didn't dare tell the king his condition might be more than just a passing tiredness. The first real clue something was seriously wrong hit in late July, when Louis started griping about a pain in his left leg. At first, he and his doctors brushed it off as a tweak from too much strolling during court events. After all, the guy was 76 and a few aches were par for the course. But this pain wasn't normal. It was sharp, relentless, and got worse no matter what they tried. Dr. Guy Crescent Fagan, Louis's head physician, threw the usual 18th century playbook at it. Bloodletting, purges, and herbal patches slapped on the sore spot. Those old-school fixes, which worked fine for small stuff in the past, did nothing for the king and, if anything, left him weaker and crankier. Still, neither Louis nor his doctors were ready to admit they were facing something way beyond their grasp. By August, the pain in Louis's leg got so bad he could hardly hobble, even leaning on his cane and his valet's arm for support. The grand court ceremonies that had defined his rule for 7 decades became a struggle as he fought to stand or shuffle down Versailles long halls. Yet Louis wouldn't cancel a single appearance or admit to his court that anything was seriously off. The courtiers started seeing changes in their king that went beyond just being worn out. His once perfect posture was slouched, his face pale despite the makeup his valets caked on. Worst of all was the faint stench coming from the king himself, a smell even the strongest perfumes couldn't cover up. By mid-August, you couldn't deny something was terribly wrong with Louis's leg. What started as a nagging pain had turned into something far worse. The skin around it was darkening, taking on a mottled, sickly hue that even the cheeriest doctors couldn't call a simple bruise. The smell, once just off-putting, was now overwhelming, and servants assigned to the king started begging for other jobs. Dr. Fagin, stumped by a condition that laughed in the face of his training, finally admitted the king might have something worse than a pulled muscle. He called in other doctors from the court and Paris, but none could figure out what was eating away at the king. Their treatments, more bloodletting, new herbal concoctions, prayers, and religious rituals, only seemed to sap Louis's strength further. The real horror of Louis XIV's condition hit in the last week of August, when the dark patches on his legs spread, and the stench from his body got so bad even his loyal servants could barely stand to be near him. What the doctors had dodged naming was now undeniable. The king's leg was rotting alive, consumed by gangrene that was creeping through his body. Each morning, his valets faced a nightmare during the lever. The king's left leg, once a symbol of his vigor, was now a blackened, oozing mess that reeked so badly they had to hold perfumed cloths to their faces just to get near his bed. The fine stockings and breeches that once showed off his regal frame now only hid the gruesome truth from the court's prying eyes. What shook me most about the king's downfall was his stubborn resolve to keep up his royal duties, even as his body was literally falling apart around him. Despite the rot eating away at him, Louis insisted on holding court, greeting guests, and sticking to the lavish ceremonial routine that had shaped his entire reign. Nobles who once scrambled for the honor of standing in the king's presence now fought to keep their lunch down, forced to carry out their roles in the increasingly foul air of the royal chambers. The palace staff, those hard-working folks who devoted their lives to serving the crown, faced a nightmare they couldn't escape. Their jobs demanded they tend to the king's personal needs, but his condition made that task nearly unbearable, like something out of a horror tale. Many begged to be reassigned to other parts of Versailles or just stopped showing up, claiming sudden sickness to avoid the stench-filled royal apartments. Those who stayed did it out of true loyalty to the king, but man, they paid a heavy price for their devotion. As the days dragged on, Louis's health kept spiraling in ways that baffled doctors and stripped away any shred of human dignity. The gangrene that started in his leg began creeping through his body, turning other patches of flesh black and putrid. His breath, once sweetened with fancy French perfumes and meticulous dental care, turned so rancid that talking to him was almost impossible. People visiting the royal chambers said the king's very presence seemed to poison the air around him, like a walking curse. Dr. Fagin and his team, grappling with a crisis that turned their medical knowledge and court etiquette upside down, started tossing out wild ideas to save him. They suggested hacking off the infected leg, a brutal, agonizing procedure that, with the crude tools of the time, would have likely killed him anyway. When Louis shot down that plan, they pivoted to religious fixes, setting up special masses and pressing holy relics against his decaying flesh. The king himself seemed trapped between denial and despair, struggling to wrap his head around what was happening to his body. This guy, who'd spent 70 years convinced he was God's chosen one, destined for greatness, now faced the raw, terrifying truth of his own mortality. Yet, even as his body crumbled, Louis clung to the grand illusions of power and ceremony that had defined his life, demanding his courtiers treat him like the glorious king he used to be. By late August, the horrors piled on as Louis's condition got even worse. The gangrene had spread so far that huge chunks of his body were now rotting, and the stench was so bad they had to burn herbs and incense non-stop to make the royal chambers bearable. Servants swore they could smell the king's decay from 3 rooms away, and even the toughest courtiers started dodging royal audiences with flimsy excuses. The saddest part, though, was Louis's insistence on keeping up his royal dignity, even as his body visibly fell apart. Every morning, his valets went through the elaborate ritual of dressing him in his fine robes, carefully draping them to hide the worst of his rotting flesh. Each day, he tried to hold court, but the sessions got shorter, and fewer people showed up as word of his gruesome state spread through Versailles. Watching their so-called divine king rot alive hit the courtiers hard, shaking the very core of their loyalty to the crown. Many started having nightmares about the king's condition, and some even began questioning the whole idea of the divine right of kings that had propped up Louis's iron rule. If God's chosen man could end up like this, what did that say about the whole system of royal power? By early September, even Louis couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The pain got so bad he could hardly speak without crying out in agony. The smell from his body was so overpowering that even he was repulsed by himself. For the first time in his 76 years, the Sun King started to accept that he might actually die, and that his death wouldn't be noble or grand. It was around then that Louis finally agreed to consider the amputation his doctors had been pushing for weeks. The surgery, sawing through his leg with no real painkillers and crude tools, was a desperate, last-ditch effort to stop the infection from killing him. But as they prepped for it, it became clear the gangrene had spread too far for the operation to do any good. Louis's mental state in those final days was almost as chilling as his physical collapse. People at court noticed he started talking to folks who weren't there, chatting with long-dead relatives and courtiers like they were standing right in front of him. He'd bark orders to invisible servants or answer questions nobody asked, turning the already grim royal chambers into a place that felt downright haunted. The religious side of Louis's decline added. The fall of the Sun King continued. Louis's rotting mouth made it nearly impossible for him to chew solid food, and the stench from his breath was so vile that servants had to keep their distance, serving him liquid meals through straws. Still, the formal dining rituals went on, with courtiers pretending they were watching a typical royal feast instead of feeding a man who was practically a walking corpse. The mental strain on the palace staff during this time was beyond imagining. Many of these servants had spent decades at Versailles, pouring their lives into serving a king they'd been taught to see as a divine figure, almost a god on earth. Watching that same king reduced to such a ghastly state shook the very foundations of their beliefs about royalty and divine favor. By mid-September, it was clear Louis was in his final days. His moments of awareness grew shorter and less lucid, though he still insisted on going through shortened versions of his daily ceremonies whenever he could muster the strength. Seeing the dying king try to hold court while his body visibly rotted created a surreal, nightmarish scene that would haunt everyone at Versailles for the rest of their lives. Dr. Fagan and his medical team, out of standard treatments, turned to increasingly wild and desperate measures. They slapped animal parts onto the king's wounds, hoping the vitality of healthy creatures might somehow rub off on him. They even tried searing the infected tissue with hot irons, a procedure so excruciating that Louis's screams echoed through the palace halls. They wrapped his rotting leg in the hides of freshly slaughtered animals, thinking the warmth might somehow spark healing. The king's family, those few still around after years of deaths and political exiles, were caught in an impossible bind. They had to keep up their roles as royal kin while watching their patriarch literally decay before their eyes. The future Louis XV, just a 5-year-old kid, was kept far from his great-grandfather's chambers, but other relatives had to carry on their court duties despite the horrific situation. The king's condition was also starting to ripple beyond France's borders. Foreign ambassadors who came to Versailles for diplomatic talks found themselves meeting with a decomposing king whose mind was increasingly shaky. Several diplomatic missions were quietly delayed or canceled as news of Louis's state leaked out, and neighboring kingdoms started bracing for the political storm that would likely follow his death. The last week of Louis XIV's life brought horrors that no amount of royal dignity or medical effort could mask. His body was so ravaged that even the most devoted servants could barely stand to be near him, and the stench from his chambers was so overpowering it seeped into the entire palace wing. Louis himself seemed to fade in and out of reality, sometimes recognizing his attendants, other times talking to long-dead courtiers from his younger days as if they were right there. In his rare moments of clarity, Louis seemed to grasp the full horror of his plight. Court witnesses said he begged his doctors to end his torment, first agreeing to the amputation they'd suggested weeks ago, then pleading for stronger drugs to dull the pain. But the medicine of the time had no real answers, leaving the king to endure his decay with only prayers and faint hope to cling to. The religious ceremonies in Louis's final days took on a frantic, almost desperate tone as the court chaplain grappled with what looked like a punishment straight from God. Masses were held around the clock, holy relics were hauled in from across France to sit by the king's bed, and whole religious communities were rallied to pray for his soul's salvation. But none of it eased Louis's physical agony or brought back any shred of dignity to his final days. On September 1, 1715, as the first light of dawn crept through Versailles windows, Louis XIV of France finally gave in to the gangrene that had been eating him alive for weeks. His death wasn't the serene passing of a beloved king. It was a release from pain so intense that witnesses described his final breath as a gasp of relief, not a quiet surrender. Even in death, the nightmare of Louis XIV's final days didn't end. His body was so ruined by gangrene that the usual steps for preparing a royal corpse were impossible. The embalmers called in to ready the king's body for his state funeral faced a task that tested both their skills and their courage. Normally, embalming meant carefully removing the organs and packing the body with preservatives. But when they cut into Louis's body, they found his organs had already turned to liquid. His intestines, meant to be preserved in special containers per royal tradition, had melted into a putrid sludge that had to be scooped out. The stench from his body cavity was so bad that several embalmers passed out on the job. Even worse, they discovered the gangrene had wrecked his organs in ways the doctors never suspected. His heart, meant to be kept as a sacred relic per French custom, was partly rotted, with blackened tissue that crumbled at a touch. The embalmers worked through the night, struggling to piece together a body that could pass for a preserved corpse at the state funeral, but their efforts fell short. The royal coffin, crafted from the finest materials and adorned with symbols of Louis's reign, wasn't built for a body this far gone. Despite their best tries, the king's swollen corpse wouldn't fit properly in the ornate casket, forcing them to strip out extra padding and seal it quickly to trap the gases still building up inside. The state funeral that followed was one of the grandest in French history, a dazzling show of royal splendor meant to honor the Sun King and shore up the monarchy's legitimacy for his successors. Thousands of courtiers, foreign dignitaries, and ordinary folks lined the route as the coffin traveled from Versailles to the royal tomb at St. Denis. The ceremony had all the usual pomp, stirring music, lavish decorations, and endless speeches about the king's greatness. But under all the grandeur, those closest to the coffin knew the gruesome truth it held. Even with the embalmer's work and layers of perfume and incense, the sealed casket still leaked the smell of decay that had marked Louis's final weeks. Several pallbearers felt sick during the procession, and the priests rushing through the funeral rites spoke quickly to avoid breathing too close to the coffin. The burial itself brought challenges that royal protocol had never planned for, as the reality of Louis's condition clashed with the ceremony's solemnity. The fall of the Sun King continued. When they finally lowered Louis's coffin into the royal tomb, the gases from his decaying body had built up so much that folks worried it might actually burst open. They had to add extra ventilation to the tomb and seal the burial chamber faster than tradition called for, just to avoid any disaster during the ceremony. Word of Louis XIV's death sparked mixed reactions across Europe, muddied by whispers about the gruesome details of his final days. While official diplomatic notes spoke respectfully of the passing of a great king, private letters between foreign courts buzzed with vivid accounts of his rotting body, both captivating and horrifying Europe's elites. The Sun King's carefully crafted image, built over 70 years of dazzling propaganda and pomp, was forever stained by the ugly reality of his death. For the French people, Louis XIV's passing wasn't just the end of a reign. It marked the close of an entire era, reshaping how they saw royal power and national identity. The king, who'd seemed untouchable, whose rule had defined what monarchy meant, was shown to be as frail and mortal as any ordinary person. The grand myth of divine kingship, which had propped up absolute monarchy, took a serious hit from the stark proof of Louis's human vulnerability in his final weeks. Doctors at the time scrambled to make sense of what had happened to the king and whether different treatments could have saved him. Dr. Fagan and his team faced tough questions from their peers, who wondered if the old-school methods of royal medicine were up to handling such serious conditions. Louis's death kicked off debates about medical practices that lingered for decades, as physicians started to see the flaws in treatments rooted more in tradition than in hard evidence. The servants and courtiers who'd seen the king's decay up close carried deep emotional scars for the rest of their lives. Many were haunted by nightmares of the stench and sight of the dying king, and some quit royal service altogether, unable to stomach working in a place tied to those horrific memories. The grand court ceremonies, once full of magic and meaning, now felt empty and grotesque to those who'd seen their purpose laid bare in such a brutal way. Versailles itself changed in the months after Louis's death, reflecting the deep impact of his gruesome end. The royal apartments where the king had rotted were completely redone. New furniture, fresh paint, different decorations, all meant to wipe away any trace of what had happened there. But even with all that, servants swore certain rooms still held a faint whiff of decay, as if the palace stones themselves had soaked up the smell of the king's mortality. The political fallout from Louis XIV's death went far beyond who'd take the throne next. The graphic horror of his decomposition shattered the carefully built image of divine kingship that had justified absolute rule for generations. Future French kings struggled to hold the same unchallenged power Louis had, as their subjects couldn't forget the image of the Sun King reduced to a rotting husk. The philosophical and religious questions stirred up by Louis's death troubled French thinkers for years. If God's chosen king could suffer such a degrading end, what did that say about divine favor and royal authority? The church grappled with these questions, unable to provide clear answers, and the doubts sparked by Louis's decay planted seeds for intellectual movements that would later challenge traditional power structures. Medical knowledge about gangrene and infections grew a lot in the centuries after Louis's death. But back then, his condition was a total failure of the healing arts. The vivid descriptions of his symptoms, saved in court records and personal letters, gave later researchers detailed insights into how such infections spread, helping pave the way for better treatments. The story of the Sun King's decomposition rippled through European culture, becoming a stark reminder of human mortality that crossed class and country lines. Artists, writers, and thinkers used the image of the rotting king to dig into ideas of power, death, and the futility of human ambition. The sharp contrast between Louis's glorious life and his degrading death became a symbol of how fleeting earthly power and glory really are. The final twist of Louis XIV's reign was that his death, not his life, left the deepest mark on Europe's consciousness. While his political and military feats were eventually outshined by later rulers, the ghastly details of his decay kept gripping and terrifying people for generations. The Sun King, who'd worked so hard to shape his image and legacy, ended up remembered as much for his death as for his life. The story of Louis XIV's final days is a harsh reminder that no amount of power can shield us from the raw truths of being human. The king, who claimed to rule by God's will, who built monuments to his own greatness and commanded a continent's respect, met the same fate as everyone else. His incredible reign, with all its highs and lows, didn't end in trumpets and glory, but in the stench of death and the quiet of a body that finally gave up its fight. In the end, Louis XIV's terrifying final days laid bare a truth no royal ceremony or divine claim could cover up. No matter our place in life, we're all just temporary bundles of flesh and bone, destined to return to the dust we came from. The Sun King's decay wasn't just the death of a monarch. It was a vivid proof that death doesn't care about rank or power, offering no special treatment to kings.